Next, we are going to be talking about China-Hollywood deals, and certainly this is a very topical panel because there are pending regulations. And to chair this panel, I'm going to invite Rob Cain from Pacific Bridge Pictures to come up, and also our esteemed panelist, John Liu from Han Pictures and Media. He's here from China. I think he flew in, yesterday, John? Last night? Okay. Chris Fenton, who's here, I hope. There he is. And Bennett Pozil from East West Bank. Okay, there's Bennett. Michael Lee from Perfect World Pictures. And finally, Sarah Platt from Wanda Studios. So, Rob, why don't you take over here. Thank you, Rob.
Thanks, Rebecca.
You're there, Rob. Okay. He's standing. Oh,
yeah.
He's standing? Oh, okay. Then we're down.
I'll put the mics in.
John? How are you? Can we see you? How are you? Good. Pleasure.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. I know we're going to have a really interesting discussion because we have 4 fantastic speakers and a very interesting topic. We're living in very interesting times. We're going to talk about the U.S.-China entertainment business relationship and trade. There's been a lot that has been happening recently, so I'm sure we're going to get into some really meaty topics. I'll just quickly introduce myself. I'd like each of the panelists to take 60 seconds or so to introduce yourselves, and then we'll jump right into it. I'm Rob Cain. I'm a producer, a writer. I also do consulting. I happen to have some special guests here from Malaysia who I'm doing business development work for. Raise your hands, guys. They're from a company called Animasia, which is a leading Asian animation company. If you're interested in that subject, make sure you go say hi to them. John, please introduce yourself.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Basically, I run the movie production company both in the United States and China. So basically, we produce a movie, a future movie, and also the TV series also. And in additional to production, we also run the distribution, and especially in China and globally. And also we run the Asian business in China also.
Hello, I'm Chris Fenton. This is my first panel since departing DMG, where I was president of the entertainment division, also ran the M&A out of the Beverly Hills office. It was a relatively large media and entertainment company with a Shenzhen-listed stock. I thought I was going to take a little time off from the U.S.-China relationship, but my work as a trustee with the U.S.-Asia Institute has put me right into the middle of a lot of the trade disputes that we're having right now that are both on a very macro level, but also affecting our entertainment and media business quite a bit. So I'm looking forward to talking about it, Rob.
You bet.
Hi, Chris. Good to see you. Rob, hi. Bennett Pozil from East West Bank, and I guess, kind of at the center of China, the U.S., media, different types of content, technology. We have a terrific business in mainland China that focuses on Chinese companies who are involved either in long-form traditional content or now in short-form or user-generated content, and also in the gaming business. In the U.S., I think we have a pretty well-developed traditional lending business as well, and also with gaming and new media, digital media. I think we've built up a wonderful franchise there over the last couple of years. And I guess this is my first panel that I've done where we're having, I think, really tough time in China, being an American, having to explain or trying not to explain Donald Trump. So I think that's.
May you live in interesting times, as they say.
Hi, everyone. My name is Sarah Platt, and I head up the international production and business development for Wanda Studios. And so a lot of what I do is interact with Hollywood studios, independent producers, and I'm looking for interesting projects to bring into the studio in China. And so I've been involved in a lot of really interesting cross-border collaboration in the very focused entertainment, film part of the entertainment industry. So.
Great. Well, Sarah, you bring a really interesting perspective. Why don't we start with asking you, what is the landscape like now in China for American and non-Chinese producers going to make films and TV in China?
Sure. I think that, and this is just my own experience, but there's a lot of interest in international Hollywood, US-based producers going to China to work. I think that in the past, potentially, there was more interest in maybe bringing a project when it was creatively right to shoot in China. But I see a lot of projects across my desk that are global in content. And at the studio facilities that Wanda has opened in Qingdao, there is a really nice mix of primarily domestic production, but some international production, and then a more sort of global hiring of crew, right? So where there may have only been local crew on a domestic production, I've seen a lot of international folks coming. And what I think makes that so special is that there's an opportunity for some cross-border collaboration, skills transfer, bringing different ideas to different kinds of filmmaking. So it's really, from my perspective, it's quite exciting.
Great. Bennett, when we spoke the other day, you mentioned that with the tensions between China and the U.S. regarding trade and what's happened with the Chinese stock market, that it's gotten a little tougher for Chinese producers to raise capital. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. It actually makes a bank more popular these days. So it's actually, I guess, kind of in a bad way, it's good news for us. So, I think, over the last couple of years, you've seen a lot of restrictions from the China side in terms of capital, the outflow of capital, and from the entertainment side, even a bigger focus on the M&A activity and what seemed to be, appropriate buying habits. That even today, for Chinese companies who are shooting local production offshore and not in Qingdao, which I guess they should probably do, they even have a hard time where they don't even want to go to SAFE, the State Administration of Foreign Exchange, to get approval to wire money out to make local content, right? So that's kind of what's happening on the China side. On the US side, and I think Chris knows a lot more about this than I do, is you have CFIUS really stepping up and a lot of noise from like, what can Chinese companies buy in the US, and Donald Trump has his own opinions. I was in China at BOAO in the beginning of April, and that was really the first time where I felt a lot of negativity in terms of the noise coming from the US, which I think is, if there's a positive intention somewhere, I don't think the style really works out. And being an amateur history buff, it's a little, all the progress that we've made, especially over the last 30 years between US-China relations, I'm worried about where it's all going to go. Now, it's possible that I don't know what I'm talking about. Well, that's actually pretty true. But it's also possible that maybe things will work out just great, and maybe there is kind of a plan. But I just don't think that we're engaging in the right type of dialogue. And it seems now we're just in this war that's ever escalating. But to the question, really, in terms of what Rob's asking, is back in June in Shanghai Film Festival, on the very, very first day, there was a panel of pretty much the China studio heads. And it had Wang Changtian of Enlight, it had James from Huayi, Yudong from Bona, and a few others there that really represent the local industry in China. And they, were concerned about not the access to bank capital or senior debt. They were concerned about the overvalued stock market. And in fact, we've seen probably on average, Chinese stocks have fallen in the last 2 months about 15 to 20%, some even higher. Meanwhile, the market overall in China is down about 6%. Those figures were a little bit worse, but it's come back a little bit. So that kind of talks about what is the future look at value of traditional film and TV and streaming in the overall marketplace and how many companies can compete. At the same time, a lot of the state-owned banks were providing junior capital in very attractive terms for the Chinese companies they were using to make content. And that's kind of going away. So there's going to be, or we're actually experiencing right now, tighter capital from China for the first time, at least in my 8 years of following this business. And I'm also interested in Chris's view on that. And also, I think at the same time, we'll see consolidation in the industry. The previous consolidation that we've seen is really content creators being acquired by content distributors. But I think now we'll probably also see consolidation on the distribution side because not all these companies are going to be able to compete.
Thanks, Bennett. Chris, you have a long background in the negotiations, and you've been close to. I know you've advised and testified to Congress on the trade relationship between the two countries. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the history, where we are now, and where you see things heading.
Okay.
You got the
I
easy
think
question.
Peter Navarro would like to know too. It's a really difficult question because for me to say I know where it's going, I would be lying. I think where it is going is, especially for this room, the outliers that were coming into the entertainment and media business, the content production type of business that were just sort of coming in, hey, we can do this too. I think the environment is both on the banking financing front and then also on the trade relations front is going to make that very difficult and actually very unattractive to people that aren't in the business because they love making content. And I think for this particular room, that's key because we're all here because we love it, we're passionate about it, we're determined to get it done. So it is weeding out the weak or the people that really have no business being in our space, okay? That's the silver lining. The tougher one to decipher is exactly where this trade, macro trade war or tension is gonna go. Just in these, the past couple weeks and the next couple weeks moving forward, we're gonna see, well, we're seeing the tariffs getting passed or at least implemented. We're expecting to see some sort of retaliation from China, which I think is going to come through the form of something that's not as obvious, which might come through the Ministry of Propaganda and messaging to consumers, which would boycott U.S. products rather than something that's more quantitative that Trump thinks is going to be a retaliation. Because we are seeing, even in the Financial Times, they did a survey, about 54% of Chinese consumers are planning on boycotting U.S. products in China, which means the propaganda machine is working. And there will be a throwback against U.S. products the same way we saw it with Korea a couple years ago and Japan in 2012. I do think it's going to be interesting to see how things play out with CFIUS, which is directed by or suggested on how to run through the FIRMA bill, which is about to get through both chambers of Congress. Ultimately, that's just a suggestion on how CFIUS works, which is under the executive branch of government, which is ultimately under Trump. So Trump is going to determine how CFIUS is operated, and that is going to be a big question. I think we'll see interesting ways that perhaps CFIUS is used to help on the EB5 real estate investment front. And then I think on higher profile things where there is a potential security debate, whether it's a Huawei or ZTE or whatever, you'll see things clamp down a lot harder. How that affects the media and entertainment business is hard to tell. Media and entertainment is hard to sort of justify a safety concern or a national security concern, but there is a freedom of speech or a censorship concern when it comes to potentially allowing in the propaganda of China into the United States, which, as we know, practicality-wise is pretty limited. So I'd like to believe that our micro area of entertainment and media won't be affected by CFIUS as much as some other industries. So I guess that's another silver lining there.
And the term CFIUS has come up a couple of times. Could you, I'm not sure
Yeah.
everybody is familiar with it.
So that's the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, which is technically a committee, and I guess it's somewhat secretive who's on that committee, but typically it is, it's supposed to be national security advisors and members from different branches of government that oversee that. So you'll have Homeland Security chief on there. You'll have somebody from the Pentagon on there, et cetera. It does fluctuate who's involved and who's not. And then there will also be different influencers from inside the White House. So as we've seen recently, there's been a big debate between Steve Mnuchin, Wilbur Ross, and Larry Kudlow on one side, and Robert Lighthizer from the USTR, and obviously Navarro, who's also very adamant against stronger, stiffer sanctions and tariffs and protectionist trade policies against China.
Thanks, Chris. Great. And John, you bring the perspective of a fund and an investor. I know you work across borders. Tell us a little bit about what you do and how things have changed in the years since you've started in film.
By the way, I forgot to tell you, my background, I has been working Wall Street, as a trader and a portfolio manager since '96. Of course, I still doing the fund management. And on the other hand, I run the picture production company. Basically, we want to produce some of the good China-centered content, and for both the movie, future movie, and also TV series for global market also. And in terms of the, capital flow, basically, the last couple of years, you see a lot, the Chinese capital basically flow out of China to in the merger acquisition in the global market, especially some of the areas they are interested, for example, like technology and the pharmaceutical, and also, of course, in the entertainment sector also, because in China, there are two areas is the weakest in terms of they want to be global #1 in China. So one of the is the entertainment sector, second the financial sector. So they are very interested in those areas. They want to learn from the Hollywood how they can produce a good movie, but the content is the Chinese story, not the American story. You guys see that, the last few years, the American, especially the big box, the US, the movie production is not doing well in China. This year, only less than 5 the big, the Hollywood big box have box revenue about 150 million. But on the other hand, at least 5 the Chinese local movie has $500 million in just Chinese market. So you can see how the difference is. Basically, they like the Chinese story, own story, not the American story. Because a lot of the American story is the original. So they like original story, like real story. So that's the thing, of course, the Hollywood try to copy what exactly happened in the Chinese market, because the Chinese market is so big. A lot of Hollywood production basically is saved by the Chinese market, So that's the thing, in the movie side. And in the capital side, basically, we see the acquisition is a slowdown because, the capital control, that's for sure. And also, on the other hand, just as the panelist says, the U.S. also doesn't want the Chinese company to buy the company in the United States. So it's a two-way, will make the merger acquisition slow down dramatically from the US and the China side.
Thanks, John. Yeah, Chris, please.
Yeah, I think you make a fantastic point in the fact that there's a very healthy China film industry now that's local language that's doing extremely well, and it's actually phenomenal that it really got kick-started after the Beijing Olympics in 2008 when the agenda was put into place to make a world-class film industry in China. And I think that's an important milestone to talk about in 2018 as we look at this trade war, because China and the U.S. are way more similar than they are different. That's something that I learned over many years. And one reason I say that is the trade protectionism that China implemented over the last few decades, and then the stuff that's really come to light since the year 2000, are really following the playbook that the United States used back in our industrial revolution in the 1800s as we were trying to catch up to the rest of the developed world, particularly Europe. So they're just following our playbook. But now China has caught up in a pretty rapid way. So as much as I am a big fan of diplomacy between the two countries, and the two countries do very much need each other, I do think it's a time where whether you love Trump or hate him, forget about that. The bigger message is, does it make sense to try to level the playing field a little now, because the time has come where China has caught up to us in a pretty nice way? And I think the answer is yes. It's just how do we go about it and how we do it in the most constructive way.
Yeah, I'm glad you bring that note. I was just going to say thank you, and I want us to continue that note of optimism. But
Yeah, no,
Bennett,
I have a question for him, right? Look, Chris is obviously well adept, with Washington, and much better, connected and savvy than I am. But I mean, look, a guy in a suit. I'm obviously like the prototypical conservative guy, right? This is what they look like. They're bankers, right? But I don't like the style of our administration. And the question that I have is that how would the U.S. react if other countries were telling us, hey, you can't do this, you can't do that, you have to change the way you do your currency? How would we react in that regard? I don't think we would be really big listeners. So, why do we need to force other countries to change when in the long term, everything always equals out? I mean, countries are going to change economic policies in the long term because that's part of survival, right? There's a positive and a negative to, I think, how they're set up now. But I'm just curious on your take on that.
Well, the word survival you use there is actually a really interesting word, because I think another word for that is leverage, right? I mean, we allowed, the United States really wanted to get that market open for all our goods and services that we sell to that market, and the growth of that market, and the ability for our companies to grow based on consumers buying product in that market. So China had all the leverage to say, if you want to have access to our consumers, you need to create JVs in China, you need to share IP and intellectual property with us, you need to share patent secrets, you need to pay tariffs, you need to deal with this or that as a protectionist policy. And we said, okay. Why did we say okay? Because China had the leverage to ask for it, and we wanted in there badly enough that we gave it. So the real question is whether we have the leverage, and I'm sorry, I'm saying we. I like both countries equally as much, although I am from the United States.
I thought you were Canadian.
Yeah. Sometimes I wish I was. I think now is the question of, okay, if we're asking China for something they don't want to give, do we have the leverage to get it? And do we have the stomach to get it? And I would argue that on a 2-year or a 4-year election cycle, which most of our elected officials are on, it's going to be very difficult to take the short-term pain to wean off of the heroin or the easy access to the market, to rebalance it and come out the other side on a healthier trade relation sort of situation. I don't think the markets will stay up if we actually really implement what we want in order to balance this trade issue. And I think if the markets fall, I think voters are going to vote a certain way, or elected officials are going to be afraid of that to happen. And I think we will pull back. If I had to bet who had more leverage in today's world, as much as I am a patriot of the United States, I do think China, thanks to their long-term horizon and their ability to look long-term on all of their decision-making, can stomach a tougher situation with a trade war than the United States. I don't know if I wanted to say that publicly, but I did.
Can I speak to something that John brought up earlier? I wanted to give a more practical example of something that I'm seeing on the domestic Chinese film front. At our studio in Qingdao, we have 30 stages that are actively working. There's a trilogy that's being made in China currently. It's called Fengshen, or The Gods, and they are investing $150 million into each one of their 3 films over the course of 2 or 3 years. They've got 20 stages at our studio for 2 years, and I feel like this is a great example of optimistically focusing on Chinese folklore and story and bringing it back to sort of maybe scaling down from some big blockbuster piece and finding stories that are going to speak to what people in China want to see. And I will also say that this is a very specific note, more production-based, but I was just there recently and I got a chance to see all of the props that were being built for the film. And it was just exquisite workmanship, beautiful handcrafted pieces. It's a fantasy piece, but it's just, I've never seen something quite like it, and I just think it's a really interesting time in filmmaking. And when I mentioned before that there were all of the opportunity to have a global crew and people bringing a perspective from both Eastern and Western ways of filmmaking, that film in particular has a producer who's American, and then a bunch of Chinese producers. There are visual effects producers and supervisors that are working together across the border, and so I think that there's a much bigger thing happening on a more national level. But really, when you come down to it, artists who are working on telling a story are doing it and trying to do it together on a global scale.
Yes.
Or I should say, international individuals are coming together to tell a special story.
Yeah, I'm glad you say that, Sarah. And there really is a lot of reason for optimism, even though we're in a period where it may not seem like things are going in the right direction. But a lot of things are. China, the box office gross for the first half of the year was $4.8 billion, almost 32 billion RMB.
Mostly on 2 movies. But.
And yeah, it's concentrated. But there's a movie now that's about cancer and drugs and pharmaceuticals that's going to hit 500 million in box office. The audience has really broadened, where you now have Indian movies making $200 million and Spanish thrillers doing really well, and art house movies. There's an audience that's developed. Loving Vincent did something like $10 or $12 million box office in China last year, which I thought was great. And they keep building theaters like crazy. It's 25 new screens every single day, and by the end of this year, China's going to hit about 60,000 screens, which is 50% more than we have here in the United States. So there's lots of opportunity. What I'd like to ask is, many of us in the room have our eyes on China and are trying to figure out how the shifts in the landscape, how to navigate that. What would you say? What are the opportunities now for people approaching the market from this side of the Pacific? Any of you, please.
Sure.
Yeah.
Back to Siphius. No, I'm kidding. That Siphius movie, God, it was a box office. It was terrific. If you think back about, maybe it was 3 years ago, Chinese movies didn't do very well in the box office, or it might have been 2 years ago, and they were saying, hey, studios, we need a few more movies this year because, you know, we want to keep this box office trend going. And what really kind of led into that and where we've come out of it is the money is better in making content for satellite television. You know, when the satellite TV market changed, you know, you can sell, you make your content, you can sell it to 2 satellite stations and to 1 internet streaming. And you know exactly how much money you're going to make. You can figure out what your production costs are going to be. And as a lot of these companies are public now, it just makes their earnings easier. There was a lot of films that were being made that would then get released and have no box office, and a lot of, you know, stress and pressure. So we saw a huge shift, at least with our client base, from making multiple films each year to trying to make as many TV shows as they could, and then get into web series and just go like straight to iQIYI or the other portals online. So what then happened from that, and what we're seeing, I think, these last 2 years, great trends in local production, is this whole thing about to kind of copy the US has kind of stopped. And, you know, trying to force in the co-productions kind of stopped, right? Co-productions are good, and co-productions could also be in any language. We have some clients who make local Chinese language movies, but because they're not Chinese, everything they do has to get approved by the China Co-Production Office. But if you look at this year with, I think, is it called like Dying to Survive, I think was the movie you were referencing, which really also hit a great, you know, social topic about the cost of medication for cancer patients. There was an amazing comedy, and I'm going to butcher the name, I'm going to butcher the English translation of the name, called How Long Will I Love You, that Xu Zheng, who produced both of these movies, this great concept about this guy and a girl who wake up and discover they're sharing the same apartment, although it's about 20 years apart. And you know, whoever like opens the front door, that's the time or the era that they're in. And you know, they try to figure out how to get each of them back to the right spot. It was such a clever, you know, local comedy. You see it with like Mahua Fun Age and what they've done locally in China and their big hits. That there's no longer this reliance on like the big master directors who have final cut, but really, you know, finding the voice of the Chinese theatrical consumer. My last point on that is, you know, to me, I think if a movie works in China, like a Western movie works in China, then it's really, really good. You know, that's kind of like a litmus test for me, you know, on things. But I don't want to speak to, I think there's a latest example that may not prove my point. But, you know, I wouldn't, you know, to me, I guess what I'm trying to say is I have fond and great appreciation of the Chinese ticket buyers and their trends. And I think that a lot of the studios can take some notes from what's happening in China and adjust maybe what's being made here.
Thanks, Bennett. I know we only have a couple of minutes left, and I'm sure there are lots of questions from the audience. Will all of you be able to stick around and afterward, and in case there are questions?
Yeah, I heard like Rebecca's bringing in In-N-Out Burger, and we're going to be here all night.
And Rebecca, do we have time for a question or two?
Anyone have a question from the audience? Okay, going once, going twice.
Okay.
I have too many. Okay, all right, thank you, wonderful panelists.
Thank you.
Thank you.